I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: who killed Biggie and Tupac? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because I've just finished watching the brand new Netflix TV series Unsolved, the murders of Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. Now, I had a few big questions going into the series, and one of the big ones was, how are they going to sell this? How are they going to create that believability factor? I don't know if you remember or you watched the 2016 TV series The People vs. O.J. Simpson, but that is a classic example of a true crime TV series that failed to sell the believability factor because they had the wrong person cast as O.J. Simpson. So they have Cuba Gooding Jr. playing O.J. Simpson. And whatever else you might think about Cuba Gooding Jr. as an actor, he does not look or sound or feel like O.J. Simpson. And so there was just this whole the whole time there's sort of a sense of disbelief when you're watching him on screen playing O.J. Simpson. I watched the whole thing and you never buy it, even up to the final episode. You never buy the fact that this is supposed to be O.J. Simpson you're watching. It pulls you out of the TV series and it just doesn't have enough believability about it. So how do you do this with two characters in Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. who are just so well known as sort of pop culture figures, and people know who they are, what they look like, they know the sound and everything else? How do you actually get actors to pull this off? And they did it. They did it really, really well. And this is a big part of the series because you never once find yourself sort of questioning or thinking, oh, that's actors playing those roles. You really sort of believe, and often at times it's very, very real, you actually believe that these are the real characters, the real figures, the real men themselves. The other question I had was, how do you keep people's interest when people already know a lot about this case? They know about these two men, they know about the murders, they know about what happened subsequently. By the way, just as a side note, if you don't know anything at all about this case, or you know very, very little, for some reason, at the end of every single episode, there is a huge spoiler which tells you what actually happened in this case. Now, I don't know why that's there. I'm assuming it's because their lawyers told them you have to go to the nth degree to ensure that no one takes legal action against you. And so you have to put this big disclaimer at the end of every episode. So if you are someone who doesn't know anything about this, about the case, about the incident, about what happened subsequently, just be aware that when you get to the end of that very first episode and every other one following it, you're going to have a big spoiler about what happened in the case that sort of gets chucked at you. But going back to the question of how do you sell people or want people to invest and watch this TV series when most people know already the case, they know what happened, and there's been other content already, a lot written and made about this particular incident. And they do a really, really good job. And what they do is they tell three different storylines concurrently, and it works really, really well. It's a very, very clever storytelling device. So you have the recent task force that went back and re-examined the crime. So that's one storyline. And then concurrent to that, you have the actual storyline of the investigations that were taking place around the time of the murders and the stuff that involved Russell Poole and that led to the writing of that book Labyrinth and a lot of the theories he had about the involvement of the LAPD. So that's the second storyline. And then thirdly, you have the storylines involving Tupac and Biggie. And not just that, but you also have flashbacks as well within that. So often you've actually got four different storylines all happening concurrently. But it works really, really well. Now, what I've just described to you might sound like a really bad idea. It might be the sort of thing where you think, how the heck do you stay aware of what's actually happening? But it actually works, and it works really, really well. Not once do you ever ask yourself, what's going on here? Who's that character? How's that tie to that? They tell the story really, really well. And the way they jump between the different timelines is just done so well to make the narrative and the sort of the flow of the story, it's just coherent. You never once find yourself questioning where you're at or who particular characters are or what does that have to do with that. It's really, really well told. Basically, this is a really good example of what I like to call journeyman writing. Now, a journeyman, for those who don't know, is either a craftsman or a sportsman who is not a genius, they're not a superstar, but they just do the basics really, really well. They're always able to deliver. You can always count on a journeyman to get the job done, and they usually have a very good work ethic to go along with it. And this is a classic example. This TV series is a classic example of journeyman writing. It's not super flashy. It's not Oscar award-winning stuff, but it does the basics, and it does them really, really well. It's still a TV series. There's still those cheesy moments that you would imagine would be there, but it does everything that it needs to well, and so you're kept engaged in the story the whole time. I remember thinking, getting to the end of the series, man, there's some Hollywood writers who need to go back and watch some more of this kind of stuff and figure out that the journeymen know what they're doing. When they write the basics well and they write a story, they don't go for all the flash, but they get everything that you need to right. It's often a lot more engaging than something that's got all the flash and all the special effects, but which just doesn't have a particularly good story. The one thing I do wonder about this series was whether or not it was actually critical enough in its examination of the whole gangster rap culture. There's been a move of late from some quarters to try and repaint and to rewrite history a little bit around the whole gangster rap thing, and to try and suggest that this was some sort of artistic, critical evaluation of this awful culture and social dysfunction that was happening in those neighbourhoods. You know, the drug addiction, the crime, the low socioeconomic problems, the fatherlessness that was very much prevalent in those neighbourhoods. But that's not what the whole gangster rap culture was about at all. Instead, it was about glorifying those things. It was about glorifying the violence, about glorifying a very false and dangerous view of masculinity, where you're this sort of violent thug and that no one ever, stands over you and you get your way by killing other people or being the guy who is the most violent and ruthless of anyone else in your neighbourhood. And obviously that is not a good thing for young men to be role modelled. And the reason that the gangster rap culture, I think, really took off was because of the issue of fatherlessness that was very prevalent in these neighbourhoods. You've got young men who are not being taught how to be young men. They're not being taught how to live out a healthy masculinity. And so what you get is certain people who start to shape a version of masculinity which is very brutal, which is lacking in virtue, which is lacking in temperance and control, social responsibility and other things. And some of these guys become artists and they become sort of very popular figures within these neighbourhoods. And so people start looking to them, and these figures who are part of the whole gangster rap scene are really glorifying this violence and this lack of virtue and lack of control, and this whole idea of, you've got to be the strongest and most brutal guy in the neighbourhood, and that's how you really make it. And so I don't know if the series was as critical in its examination of that aspect of the whole gangster rap culture. However, I will say this for it. Firstly, this wasn't really a TV series that was focused on the social questions in those neighbourhoods. It touches on them from time to time. I don't think it does a particularly good job at times of doing that. It tries to touch on the very serious tragedy of this violence that was going on in these neighbourhoods, but it feels a little bit forced. The one or two times when it actually does that, it's sort of perhaps missing a little bit of that human touch. However, the focus of the show is primarily about the investigation of these murders and sort of what happened subsequently. So I don't know if I can fault it too much for the fact that it didn't take a hard critical look at the whole gangster rap culture, because that wasn't really the main focus. The one thing I will say though is that it didn't actually glorify the gangster rap culture either, and I think that's a really, really good thing, because there's a lot of content out there that explores the whole gangster rap thing, that features the whole gangster rap culture, and what it actually ends up doing is glorifying it, and this TV series didn't do that. The other thing that's interesting about the show is the character of Russell Poole. So you have Biggie and Tupac, who are the murder victims, and then Russell Poole is that main figure who becomes world famous for his involvement in the initial investigation of these murders not long after they've just happened. And then subsequently he begins to develop this whole theory about the LAPD being involved and about this idea that he has that police officers are involved in these murders, and he really becomes quite obsessed with this. But Russell Poole is presented in a very sympathetic light in the series, and I think in a good way. They don't buy into perhaps the obsession and the conspiracy theory stuff, but what they do is they show you that this was a man who genuinely wanted to solve these crimes. He was a police officer who wanted to do his job, but because of the bureaucracy and what was happening within the bureaucracy at the time, he was hampered from actually mounting a good and proper investigation of these crimes. And really you get the sense that really would have made a huge difference if he'd actually been allowed to follow the various evidence trails where they lead. Now, in many ways, for those who sort of know the history of what was going on in the 90s in LA, and particularly with the police, it really does make sense. And you understand why this happened the way that it did. And you realize that the murders of Biggie and Tupac, they really happened at a time where if you wanted a good and effective police investigation of these sorts of crimes, these two murders took place at the very wrong moment in history. So you've got 92, you have the LA riots, the whole Rodney King thing, and that's still very fresh in people's minds. It's still a raw and open wound for a lot of people. And then you have these murders that take place in 96. And it's still, there's this big cloud hanging around LA and the LAPD in particular. And then 97 is when the whole Rampart scandal kicks off. And so they're really caught, these murders happen right at that very tumultuous period where that police corruption, the wound is sort of being pulled back on that whole thing of police brutality, police corruption, the suspicion, the distrust. And so this murder investigation takes place within a police force where there are some pretty serious cultural problems that are starting to come to the fore, and those cultural problems and the responses to them clearly do have an impact on how these particular crimes were investigated. And so I really appreciated the fact that they included that as a strong part. Like Russell Poole, as I said, is a third main character, and it really helps to drive the story, and I think to bring something perhaps a little bit fresh to the telling of this particular incident, these two crimes and the sort of the investigation that happened. Overall, I think this is a really, really watchable TV series. It's something, as I said, that doesn't glorify that whole gangster rap culture. It's engaging, the story keeps moving, and it focuses in, I think, on some of those really central questions about, what happens when a crime like this happens? Why, how is it that police departments can perhaps end up not investigating things the way that they should? And it really explores perhaps the bureaucracy and the reality of, I guess, the frailty of human nature, and how that frail human nature affects even things that we often think of as being infallible and sort of foolproof, like a police department or our judiciary or the people who are charged with keeping us safe and investigating these kind of crimes. And for a TV series, as I said, that's just a journeyman series. It's not Oscar-worthy stuff. It actually does, I think, a pretty handsome little job of sort of touching on those issues. It's well worth watching. If you don't know anything at all about this case, it's probably going to be quite an enjoyable series for you. If you're someone who knows a lot about the case like I was, it's still an entertaining and enjoyable piece of television. So there you go, Unsolved, the murders of Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. I'd love to hear your thoughts though, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. There's a link in the description below and a link on screen at the end of this video. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you next week on The Daily Question.